Good evening, everyone. My name is Sergio Gatto. I'm a dramaturg, a researcher, and theatre critic, and I work as a coordinator of cultural projects at the National Theatre Emilia Romagna Teatro Fondazione in Modena. This is the fourth episode of Into Perspective, Dialogues on Theatre, a series of conversations with theatre and dance artists and practitioners. The project is the result of a collaboration between Emilia Romagna Teatro and the Department of Arts-La Soffitta at the University of Bologna, and is curated by Gerardo Guccini, Claudio Longhi, and Rossella Mazzaglia. The main aim of this project, Into Perspective, is to give voice to intellectuals and artists from Italy and all over Europe, and all over the world, actually, to present their work, their modes of creation, to learn more about their point of view on the role of the performing arts, especially in such a shifting and radically changing situation of the past months. And each cycle is related to a thematic thread, like a constellation of different galaxies. The one we are currently traveling through is entitled Body World, and investigates the relationship between these two terms, body and word, how the concept of body affects the imagery and the practices of everyday life and the conventional order of reality of the world. As the title of the project says, we are particularly interested in new perspective from which to observe certain issues in the light of the post-pandemic era, especially. The series Body World has already hosted the Belgian ensemble FC Bergman, choreographer Cristina Cristal Rizzo, and actress and director Chiara Guidi. Today we have the pleasure to meet and warmly welcome Matthew Lenton, founder and artistic director of the Glasgow-based theatre company Vanishing Point. Good evening, Matthew.
Hey.
How are you doing today?
Good, thank you. Yeah.
So Matthew Lenton's work with Vanishing Point has been performed, as we all know, in over 20 countries across Europe, South America, Russia, and China, and hopefully somewhere else in the future. If I had to point out some of the main characteristics of your work, I would be using some keywords such as, for example, ambitious. I would point out abstraction. I would say visual theater also, surreal and multimedia theater. But I would love if you completed your own presentation, as we already did with the other artists, and perhaps even say something completely different about yourself. So my first question, welcome question, is what's your story, basically, your past and present, and your self-presentation of your work, if you will.
It probably goes back to, you know, all of the things that you said there. I think are probably true, but I never really think about what the work is. It's just that it's in a way it's the work that I've learned to make over the years, and the direction that I've been drawn in by, I suppose, the things that have my intuition, the things that have interested me. When I go back to the beginning, I suppose it was really an accident. I was a student at Glasgow University. I met some other students. I had an idea to do a show that was a particularly distinctive idea. It was an idea to do a show in total darkness, so that you really couldn't see, the audience really couldn't see their hand in front of their face. And so although it was aural, it was also very experiential, because the audience would come in and be seated by the actors. No one could see anything. And it was a really good show to do as students, because we didn't have any money, and all we really needed was an empty room with a flat floor, lots of chairs, and lots of bin liners to black out the windows and to get all the light out of the room. And so that was, and lots of people at the time told me it was a crazy idea to do a show that no one could see. I think when you're that young, it doesn't matter that it's a crazy idea because you've got nothing to lose. So, you know, we didn't have any money, we didn't have any audience, we didn't have any reputation, we didn't have anything. So it didn't matter that it seemed like a ridiculous idea. So we just did it. And I think that probably that's the thing that you've got to hold on to over the years as you develop as an artist. Even though you gain a reputation, and even though you gain money, and even though you gain all these things, the thing that you have to be careful not to lose is that impulse, that it doesn't matter that it's a ridiculous idea. It doesn't matter that everyone tells you it's crazy, because it's easy to become afraid by all of these things that other people say. And it's easy to become afraid because when you have got something to lose, you start to think, oh God, maybe I'd better do things the proper way. And I don't know what the proper way is, because I've never learned under another director. I never trained as a director. I never studied as an assistant director. We just did this thing. So after the show In the Dark, we did another one, and then another one. And you know, there was a period, maybe when we made our third show, that we started to get a little bit of money, and we started to be in the newspapers. And suddenly I became really afraid, and I started to think to myself, I need to do things properly now. I need to do things like, you know, this director that I admire, or that director that I admire. And so I'd read about how other directors did things, which in a way is important because it's part of your training and your reference points. But it totally just, like, I totally lost my voice for maybe 2 shows, and I made 2 or 3 shows that were terrible, but very formative, you know. So in that sense, very important, but absolutely terrible derivative shows that weren't me, but sort of me trying to channel what other people might have done. Mm-hmm. And it took a very bad experience working on one show where I was utterly miserable for the whole process. And then I thought to myself, I'm never going to do that again. From now on, I'm only going to do things my way. And even if that's the wrong way, and even if that breaks all of the rules of the things that you're supposed to do, I'm only going to do things my way. And so since then, that's what I've been doing. So each show begins with a different idea, and there's no formula really to the way that we make work. Apart from that, it normally starts without a script, without a written theatre script, and it's developed from day one with all of the artists in the room together. So actors, lighting designers, set design, everybody's in the room together, and we follow the direction through the work that we make in the rehearsal room every day. So
let me react to this. It's very interesting because I always wondering about how theater is probably nowadays the most free among all the art forms, in my opinion, because of course you can do, for example, some very experimental cinema, but at the end of the day, you always going to need, you know, a machine that actually passes from one face to another, or a landscape. Everything is passing through the same technical equipment. But with theater, you can actually change as you just said, you change your perspective each and every time, especially when you work as a collective. So I'm particularly interested in how you develop the whole process, the whole creative process, starting from a simple idea, a simple detail, maybe, or the one about the show In Complete Darkness. How do things can develop into a collective creative process with Vanishing Point, or in your mind with your many personalities, maybe, who knows?
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's interesting because it is a collective way of making work, but it's not a democratic way of making work. And in the end, you know, I consider myself to be more than a director. Now, I might not be an artist. That's in a way that's for other people to decide. But what I think I am is an author. So when I make a theatre show, it's like me writing a play on paper, except for that I'm doing it in a room physically with people. So what I need is experts, people who are experts at what they do, and not people who are experts at what I do. So I don't want to work with another director or someone else has an equal right, in a way, to say what the way things are going to be. I want to work with actors who are expert actors, and a lighting designer who is an expert lighting designer, and so on. And it's really important for me to allow all of those people to be creative in what they do, and to tune into the process from their perspective, and to see things in it from their perspective. Mm-hmm. It allows them to grow and contribute their art form within the process. In terms of what happens in the room, it's very hard to explain, but I think it's to do with the fact that in my head I can see lots of things that it's very hard for me to share with everybody as we're going along. So often it will start with a really simple improvisation, for example, with two actors sitting on chairs, and I try to take away their need to think about anything apart from their connection with each other. So they don't have to worry about geography. So they might be playing a very simple provocation or a very simple scene that's set in a kitchen, but the kitchen isn't important, and we don't want to even think about the kitchen at this stage on the third day. What's important is the fact that someone wants something from the other one, and they happen to be in a kitchen, maybe. So we do work that really strips away everything apart from the contact between the two actors. So a provocation might be one person has to visit another person in the hospital. This person wants to come home from the hospital, but this person is telling them that they have to stay. And that's the only information that I'll give the actors. And it's because the idea for the show is that we're making a show that's about caring for people. So this is an idea that we'll have for a scene. How do you compassionately deliver this news to someone that they're going to have to stay in hospital? But that's all the information that I'll give to the actors, and they'll start the improvisation. And sometimes I'll let it go on for ages until nobody knows what they're doing, but they have to keep doing it, or we all have to keep doing it. And then at the end, we'll ask what was interesting and what wasn't interesting. And we'll maybe take some things from it, and we'll begin to start again. So we go back to the beginning, but now we have a little bit of information that we're interested in. And, you know, often while all this is happening, I'll be imagining in my head all sorts of things going on behind them that they're not even worrying about, and they shouldn't be worrying about. I'll maybe be starting to imagine a setting or how this thing might begin to emerge in a visual space. And maybe I'll turn to the sound designer, and I'm like a madman. I'll just start to say, and they'll start to bring in some music, and I'll say, you know, more melody, less melody, louder, quieter, and we begin to discover how sound relates to what's happening, and then the lighting designer will maybe begin to play with some light. So all of these things are sort of happening together. But quite often, I think, if you asked the other people, they'd say that until maybe somewhere near the end of the process, they're really guessing what it's going to be, but it's somehow a vision that I'm slowly forming day by day. So I'm seeing all this other stuff that maybe other people aren't worrying about, and
that's really interesting. And I've always been passionate about writing, for example, and I've always been writing, and the process is not that far away from this, because you vomit all these words and you can see them forming on the page, and then you realize that it's a complete mess. So you have to take this or that paragraph away and see if what you were trying to tell still it's still there or not, and you probably going sideways compared to what was your initial idea. So, for example, with improvisation, which is a technique that many directors use, in fact, to start off this, to sparkle up the creation. So my question would be, so you start with a gigantic theme issue in your mind, or do you start from very little details and impressions or epiphanies in a way? What do you do? How do you choose to work on this or that issue?
Yeah, I think it really is something that comes to me
okay,
one way or another. So, and that can be really different. So, for example, when we made a show called Tomorrow, for example, which ended up being really about it, lots of actors on the stage who wore these prosthetic masks that made them look very old, but the audience could see that they were young actors underneath. This came from an idea of a really simple idea of having, for example, of having 10 actors on the stage, all of whom were very, very old actors. So they were all in their 80s or 90s, and I wanted them to be effectively living in an old people's home and doing almost nothing. So we'd be watching just their minute activity, you know, eating, watching television, while the nurses came in and moved around them. And I had an idea that in the last 10 minutes of the show, I wanted one of these old actors to begin to suddenly do things physically that it would be impossible for them to do. And they would begin to move and dance and something. And the show would end with them taking off their mask. And so it would be revealed that they weren't an old actor, but they were a young actor. So that was the idea. It was as simple as that. And to go along with that, because I think it's important that you have to be able to connect a visual idea with a theme that comes from your soul or your heart or whatever you want it to be. It was about something about caring for people and how we care for people and how we care for old people particularly. So that was the starting point. And all I'd say is that when we began to experiment on the first day of rehearsals, I totally had a panic because or when we did some development, I panicked because when we had one of these masks as an experiment, but when I put a young actor in the mask and I sat the young actor, and the masks were very expensive and they looked fantastic, but when you put them on stage next to a real old actor, suddenly the mask looked totally fake. And I realized that we'd never be able to persuade the audience that one of these actors was not, you know, that all of these actors were old. It would be so clear that one of them was wearing a mask if all the other actors were really old. So I went home and just started to think, what can I do? And you have to, when you're making a show like that, you have to make decisions quite quickly sometimes. And I just decided we'd switch it round, just do it the other way. So we'd have a young actor and we'd have some other actors force the mask onto the young actor and turn them old. And then we did that scene the next day, and suddenly the show became all about that.
So if I understand correctly, in the first part of this show tomorrow, the young actors wearing old men masks, they were using their body to pretend to be old. So well, the mask.
That's interesting, because in the end we decided that they should because the audience see the mask go on, that it took on a more symbolic quality than naturalistic or realistic quality. So in the end we decided that the actors shouldn't behave old, but they should take on a way of moving that didn't draw attention to their age. And that's a very different thing, I think, because if you act old you know, there's all sorts of cliches or stereotypes about acting old, but in the end we just decided that it was better to limit the movement of some of the actors. But of course, because the audience at the beginning of the show see that it's really a young actor, and he believes he's young, and he turns up at the hospital expecting to give flowers to his newborn baby, but all the nurses are treating him like a child, and he doesn't understand why. And then finally they force this mask onto his head and take his clothes off and dress him up in pajamas. And suddenly the audience sees where he really was all along, which was in this old people's home. And it's only in his mind that he's in the hospital. So I think there's something there about finding a theatrical, you know, I always say that when we make a show, we try to find form and content together. We can't just have an idea and then apply the idea of the play to that. Every show has to be different in form because the content is different. So we need to try to find a form that sets that idea free in a way. So in that particular show, it was about these masks and the interplay that the masks had with the actors, but also with the audience. And but with another show, it can be really different. You know, like with Metamorphosis, it was because I didn't have any other ideas myself, and I thought to myself, I want to find a source material that I don't necessarily love to begin with, and can approach it from more of a distance. And when I read it, or when I reread it after 20 years, it seemed to me so strikingly relevant in terms of the way that we see immigration and difference, and a fear of immigration and difference and otherness in our world today. It seemed to me so much to be speaking about that was the idea that I fell in love with when I read the book, and that was the starting point for that show.
Yeah, I think that this is the special thing with, you know, with classics of literature that can really wake up in different moments of history, telling something really different than the first time you read it or saw it. And I think that the way you explained your work in Tomorrows, it's a proof of what I was trying to say earlier, that this kind of very subtle creative and cognitive process, you can actually do it only in theater. Because I was wondering about cinema, for example, in films, if you put and it happens very often that they put young actors playing old characters, but on the other hand, the only way to do it is just, you know, with a very heavy makeup, that the only thing they can do is pretend to be old or pretend to be ugly, for example. You know, there's kind of a trend lately. There's been a trend, you know, these beautiful actors dressed up and made up as ugly people or old people. In theater, you can actually balance the two dimensions of what you are seeing, but what you are reasoning on. So the result is very complex and stays complex. And that's what I love about performing arts, that it's always a negotiation of meanings and new senses that you actually create on stage, because you are sharing a space and time continuum with spectators. And also with Metamorphosis, that's a good example of how a very famous, maybe the most famous among Franz Kafka's novellas or novel, can really tell you something different every time you open the book. Opening the book, you try to transform, and it's and the very plot is about transformation. Someone who, you know, finds himself transformed into something really ugly and disgusting, and it's a great metaphor of what you can do from such a powerful starting material like classic Kafka.
I mean, when you read a book like Metamorphosis, I think if you read the book as a director or as a theatre artist, if you read the book and you finish the book and you think, I want to tell the story exactly as Kafka told it, then you shouldn't make that story. I think you need to be able to, probably the first time you read the book or the first time you read the text, whatever it is, you need to have an intuitive reaction to it, in which you see something that's important for you. And I think, for me, when I reread Metamorphosis, it was just this idea that when Gregor wakes up again, when he wakes up the next morning, he's turned into someone who is essentially a foreigner, and who looks different, who has a different skin color, who speaks a different language, and he's lost in his new environment, and just wants some help. But his family suddenly see him as being different, and they can't help him. They don't want to help him. And of course, at the beginning, they try a little bit, and they pity him, and they try to. But the real transformation in Metamorphosis, I think, is the transformation of the family, not the transformation of Gregor. Because at the beginning, he turns into a bug, but he could still be a bug that other people care for or look after. But he turns into a bug that everybody slowly begins to hate and be afraid of, and and in the end, they effectively exterminate him. And this to me was telling the story of immigrants all over Europe at the moment. That something that's happening, and that was the first time I read it. I was like, that's what I saw, and that was the idea that I had to follow. And I think that it's really important for any director to have that initial reverberation. It's like when you read it, it's got to do something to you that you see. Otherwise, you shouldn't do it, I think. But it's interesting you talking about cinema, because I've been thinking a lot about this lately. And because so many, I don't know about in Italy, but in the UK, in Scotland, so many people so many theatre artists have now started making work online. And I have such a big problem with it, because it's for lots of reasons. Politically, I think that I think the danger is it's exposing the art form in a way that plays into the hands of its enemies. And I've said this here, that a lot of people who don't like art subsidy are saying, when they see stuff that's streamed online or broadcast from the theatre, they say, this is shit. Why are my taxes paying for this? And the problem is, a lot of it isn't good, and a lot of the time, what we end up with, when you ask theatre artists, it seems to me that when you ask theatre artists who are very clever and innovative and imaginative in a theatre environment, but when you ask them to make work for an online platform, they end up with 100 monologues to camera, and I just don't understand what that is, and who that's for. And I was thinking to myself, when I go to what is it about theatre that's important? Interestingly, there's a new film on Netflix called Homemade, which is it's a series of short films made by filmmakers, well-known filmmakers, in lockdown. And their approach to making these short films is so different from the theatre makers trying to make films online. And they think in a completely different way. There's iPhones attached to drones which fly out of windows. There's whole films made based on text message conversations. Whereas the theatre artists who are making films seem to me to be, in this country anyway, mainly doing monologues. Someone sits and talks to a camera for 20 minutes. Without really interrogating who they're talking to, or what the nature of this relationship is between two people. And they're just not thinking about this at all. So I think it's really important at this time that we have to really fight to defend the live arts, to value the live arts. That if this is something we as a culture and that our governments think is important, we have to wait and put our resources into the moment when the arts can be live again. And it seems to me that that's so important. And what is it about that that's important? You know, and I thought to myself that I don't know about you, but when if I'm going to the cinema to see a film, I never think, I hope the cinema's full. I always think, I hope it's empty. Then I can sit and I can have the whole cinema to myself. But when I go to the theatre, I think, I hope it's full. I don't want to sit in an empty auditorium. I want to be there with people all around me, experiences. So what's the difference? And I don't necessarily have an answer to that, but I do know that when you go to the theatre, the presence of people around you sharing this experience is so important in a way that's totally different, I think, from seeing a film in the cinema.
No, I agree. And you dug out a lot of different paths. And I'll tell you this, we've been experiencing this huge problem of the great amount of streaming, theater streaming online for the past 2 or 3 months. And I had the same feeling as you. You were, before you were talking about having something to lose or nothing to lose. And I always had the feeling that when I was watching at these theater streamed online, well, there was a lot of things to lose. For example, the special relationship that we were talking about earlier before, the fact that you are sharing the same situation. Like, for example, when I watch some theater streaming online, I'm in my room, in my bedroom sometimes. So my disposition as a spectator, it completely changes. And when you were talking about cinema, I think that some of filmmakers are starting very, very quickly to understand the difference between showing their products on a big screen in a cinema or on a small screen of a computer or a TV. Like, for example, when I went to the movies to see last Martin Scorsese's film that was produced by Netflix and streamed, it was a project that was born for Netflix, so for the small screen, I could see the difference because, normally Scorsese has this long piano sequence, I don't know, these long sequences without interruptions, with no montage or no editing. But in that case, it was, of course, he had these beautiful actors, so he could actually pass from one close-up to the other. But you could sense that he was working on the special needs of online streaming and homemade films. But in theater, how can you do that? We had a lot of conversation about this here in the National Theatre, because of course the biggest difference was that many independent artists, actors and actresses mainly, they felt the need to express themselves even during lockdown, and they would come to terms with all these difficulties, having no means, having no subsidies, but still they wanted to express. They had to keep on, in fact, even only because they had to be present on the national scene. But for a national theatre, which is subsidized by the government, by the ministry and local administrations, you have a complete different feeling. You have a mission. In fact, you should keep on. And even though you could not actually produce new shows because rehearsals were impossible, you had to play a little bit with the format and try to find new ways to inject theater in something that has to be different in a way. You cannot try to create the same impressions and the same emotions that you normally do in theater, like the examples you brought up before. I thought about another Vanishing Points show. It was Interiors. It was some years ago now, and that was I would like to talk with you about this because it really struck me very, very strongly, because there was a very clear idea in the way you were trying to work with the spectator in terms of build up a story that was there because the main material was Maeterlinck's text, but it was completely transformed into something new. And I remember there was this screen, and behind the screen, this group of actors were playing, and you could not hear what they were saying. And there was this other presence that came out on the stage and telling another story, not necessarily the one you were building up in your mind. And it was really strange and unsettling sometimes, uncanny, I would say, because you were building up your own story, and especially in relation with the relationships between the different characters, and you were trying to follow this story, and then the ghost, the other presence, would tell you a complete different story. So you were pushing on different layers and layers of complexity based on something that could be really simple, just a family story, like we saw many times in cinema. But density, that was, I was saying, the density of the narrative was completely changeable, more and more. So, yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things about interiors that was very important for me, and I think this is what we're talking about here, is the relationship between the stage and the audience. And for me, it's never enough just to show the audience a play where the audience's relationship to the play is not questioned. So for me, if you have an audience in a theatre watching something, it's really important that the audience play a role, some kind of role in what they're watching. Now, I'm personally less interested in what might be called, site-specific theatre, where the audience are walking around and someone jumps out at them with a chainsaw and scares them. But in a way, it's the same thing. I want a much more subtle version of that, but in the auditorium, within the theatre. So with interiors, what happens at the beginning is that there's a window that the audience is looking through, and you see people arrive to have this meal together, this party together, and you can't hear what they're saying. And gradually you begin, as an audience, I think, if you're engaged with it, you begin to think, who am I? Who am I watching these people? Am I alive? Am I dead? Am I a ghost? Am I watching them from and very interestingly, whenever I watched interiors in a theatre, the audience would be divided into two groups within 10 minutes. And there was one group that would, as it went on, they would slowly lean forward on their seats and become really almost hypnotized by it. And there was the other group that would sort of just sit back and start to look around at their friends as if to say, what the hell's happening here? I can't hear anything. And I think it's the first group that I'm much more interested in. It's the group that understand that they have a kind of perhaps voyeuristic role in a theatre show. And I think I'm
because it's sorry, Matthew.
I just said I'm very interested in voyeurism, I think, in the theatre.
No, I remember my feeling was that, when you find yourself in a crowded place and everybody's speaking at the same time, and if you actually, how it works, if you focus your attention on two people, you actually have the feeling that you are hearing them and listening. You can't listen to them, even though they are talking in the very same time of 100 other people. But the unsettling thing was the fact that you were not actually able to hear anything because it was completely mute. But I confirm you, I was in the first group, the one who was trying to, watch him closely and closely to understand at least one of the many, many relations that were, setting up on stage. And I think that this is very well attached to our body world thematic, because of course, we know that during these past months also to gather around what we said before about relationship between our view and screens. In the very past months, we were forced to reorganize our relationship with the physical presence of the other, because we could not actually interact with anybody, and everything was, I would say, forcibly mediated by more and more complex architecture of machines, because everything was taking place through a technical mean. And I'm interested in the word interface, which we also have in Italian, interfaccia, which is a clear demonstration of the so-called human-computer interaction that really exploded in this past few months, a concept that seems to design a mirror which a human being must confront every time he wants to interact with someone else. When you work online, you see theater streaming online. So since you have extensively worked also with multimedia screens and in a way also cinematic sets, and you were trying to carve a new perception out of a out of a precise organization of a visual system. My question would be, do you think that the situation we were and are experiencing might affect our view of the world in the future as artists, as spectators, and part of the human society?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. And I think, I think I'd start by saying that all of my influences and interests as a young man were cinematic. Actually, I didn't ever go to the theatre as a child. I wasn't taken to the theatre until I was didn't go to the theatre until I was in my 20s. So all of the things that I watched and that nourished me were films. So I think that there's definitely a sense that my work in the theatre has a cinematic influence in it, not just visually, but in how it's constructed. It's rarely constructed like a well-made play. Mm-hmm. It's a different thing altogether. So that's definitely, like, cinema is definitely a huge influence on me and my work. But having said that, I don't want to go to the theatre and see cinema or TV, and I don't want to have to watch theatre online. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier, in a way that I've really tried to think about this. Like what are we trying to do by making theatre online? Is it possible that it can be an evolution of the art form? Or not? And the conclusion I keep coming to is that theatre is and has to be a live event. And so if we stop making that, and if we evolve in towards making more and more content for online platforms, then we can't call it theatre. We have to call it something else, and that's okay if we want to change what theatre is. But we've got to think of a new name for it, because it's not theatre. Theatre is a live event. But also, I'm a kind of a rebel in a way, and it's, this whole situation is very interesting to me, because a certain percentage of me is a conspiracy theorist. Maybe 30% of me is a conspiracy theorist, and I spend some of my time with the 70% of me trying to persuade the 30% of me not to be stupid, and that this is all exactly what it is, which is a very serious pandemic which started in a wet food market in Wuhan. Mm-hmm. And it's but the 30% of me is saying, no, Matt, for goodness sake, look around you. This is a sinister global conspiracy to get people exactly where the powers that be want us, which is locked into our own homes, which is to become more and more obedient and unquestioning about things that it's so morally abhorrent to question that we have to order all of our stuff online. We have to be, our social interactions are limited. Our ability to gather together, to to rebel together is limited and restricted, it seems so obvious to the 30% of me that this cannot just be what it seems to be. And the truth probably is that, you know, as always is the case with the kind of capitalist society that we live in, that there are powers that will always try to capitalize on a situation like this, and they'll try to make it so that they can get what they want out of it. But, you know, it seems to me that every fiber of my being wants to rebel against that idea that we have to be confined and that we have to look at these screens and that we have to interact with people through these screens. And even if that means waiting and conserving our energy and building up ideas and building up frustration and building up anger and building up, you know, so that when the time comes, we can really burst forth with all of these things that have been building up in us for this year, you know. And that's the way I think of it, you know. I'm waiting for that moment, and I think we have to, you know, obviously we have to be sensible. We don't want to go around infecting people and killing people, and, you know, we have to listen to sense, but we also have to question. And I don't really understand how you can be an artist and not have that 30% or 20% or 10% that's going, are you crazy? Look what's happening. It's exactly what the powers that be have always wanted, you know. And the artist in me, whether that artist is 1% or 10% or 50%, has to fight that, has to find a way of resisting that, you know. And that's the tools that I have to do that are through the live arts, you know, call it theatre or music, but the live arts and live assembly, you know. And there are definitely enemies of that idea.
No, it's interesting because it's been 2 years now that since we had our last chat, and you were in Modena rehearsing the production of 1984, and we had this long conversation about being afraid of what the others, these big brothers, are trying to do with us. So I'm not sure what was the percentage at that time 2 years ago between your 30% and your what was the balance between 70 and 30%, but interestingly enough, the core issue was the same, because we constantly have the feeling that something else is there and it's not visible and is trying to take control over us. And of course, during these past months, it was so evident, because we all spent much more time in front of a computer screen, searching things online, you know, browsing websites, making researches for our work, for our show, and all our informations were gathering up in small and very definite boundaries, you know, around what was your interest at the first sessions you had on a computer, and what was your interest at the end of that session. That, you know, your mind just goes around and around, and you, at the end of the day, you have the feeling that you are driven by someone else that you can, or something else that you cannot actually locate there, but your mindset is changing, and very very rapidly sometimes. So I would have a last question for you that derives from this issue, and is, do you think that arts and theater and performing arts can do something to talk to people about these issues, and probably to establish a new discourse, to reactivate an attention on, not necessarily on conspiracy theories, but to help the people to get more acquainted with these issues?
I don't know, but when I look around at the moment, you know, I see there's a lot of anger in the world, you know, and I see that live assembly as being such an important thing in making any kind of change. You know, at the moment we have the Black Lives Matter protests around the world, you know, and you know, I suppose there's a question there, you know, because there's this tension of, you know, there are these protests going on, you know, are very important protests. On the other hand, people are thinking, well, you know, it's really important that we don't have protests at the moment because of this disease, this infection that's, you know. And I guess at the point, you know, at a certain point, you have to think, well, which is the most important, you know, thing. But what I do notice is how important live assembly is. People gathering together in complicity or in anger or whatever it is, to try to create change, you know, because it's something that can't not be seen. And so, you know, when I see these things happening around the world, I think that I can't quite, you know, relate it at the moment, but I think that it's something about live assembly and people coming together, and whether that's in a theatre to watch a really polite, nice, middle-class theatre show, or whether it's something that's more anarchic and more chaotic and more, you know, that actually maybe theatre has a role to play in that, you know, like that people coming together, and, or, you know, like live music, like the raves of the 80s or 90s, you know, when people would rebel by having these secret gatherings, you know. It seems to me that that's what I'm interested in somehow. It's how maybe theatre can and will adapt from being a kind of a quite politely contained world where we all buy our tickets and go and sit in an auditorium and watch a show, towards something that's perhaps more chaotic, more forceful, but still based on the idea of live gathering and live assembly. And I think it's hard to control people when people can come together and talk to each other and be with each other.
I think that this tells a lot about the actual influence that the performing arts can have on the relationship between body and world. In fact, I agree with you. It's crucial that we take care of the collective experience, and not necessarily, I would say, not necessarily stick into a norm or a well-made play or the usual disposition that a spectator might have towards a performing arts event, but trying to gather people. I think it's important. And we were talking about this before when you said that some of us is frightened by the fact that theater could be submerged by all this production of virtual stuff. I'm one of those who thinks that if we look back at the history of theater, which is really ancient, as we know, theater had always found a way to express itself in a new way. So like human beings do, it's kind of a continuous adaptation to new forms. So probably like when what they said when the cinema was born, that everybody was worried that theater would be submerged by the influence of cinema and the changing language of cinema. And the result was that theater ate cinema in a way, because it imported into its own languages all these technicals, new means and medias. So I think that we will find a way anyway, but I agree with you that we should really take care of the collective experience. And I really really hope that we can see the result of Metamorphosis, which was about to be presented in Via Festival in Cesena.
Yeah.
Last March. What was that? Yeah, February. So we all hope to see you here and everywhere else. And
I can't wait to come. I can't wait to be in a different place, you know.
Yeah, me too. So we should switch. You come to Italy and I come to UK.
Yeah, but I think it's really true, you know, that the only difference is that, you know, if we all become separated by screens in some sort of dystopian future, you know, is that the end? Is that the point at which there is no more theatre? When we're all like in an H.G. Wells, you know, time machine type story, we don't need to go anywhere anymore, so we don't need to have human interaction anymore. Will that be the thing that finally kills theatre? But even then, I think that there'll be disobedient groups that gather in underground settings, and you know, there'll be rebels, there'll be people who disobey the rules, and I think that's what theatre's always done as well. It's always disobeyed the rules. It's, you know, so there'll always be that illicit urge to be together, I think, with other people. And I think we're really
also, because I think that theatre, the deepest root that theatre has always had is a political one. So it's something that really tries to emerge and to explode and finding new ways and digging new paths to its own recognition, self-recognition, and it really needs a great amount of people. So, okay, Matthew, I think I really thank you so much, and that was really nice talking to you. Thanks for your generosity, and hope I'll see you very soon here or there or somewhere else. Thanks again.
Let's see you soon.
Thank you.